I'm excited to continue looking at the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? One of the arguments that comes regarding the resurrection is that most of the witnesses that we have, we call them the Gospels, are recorded and they're Christian Gospels, so that the evidence, the textual evidence, is largely from a Christian account. Certainly it's understandable why some people would say that it's biased when the major witnesses to it are written by sources friendly to it. I want to look at a couple of pieces briefly regarding the quality of the evidence. Looking at the original Gospels and saying, are they trustworthy? Are they authentic? Can we believe them, particularly when it comes to the story or the account of the resurrection? First, a little bit of manuscript evidence. So there are 66,000 manuscripts. Now, when we think of that, we're not talking about a stack of 66,000 Bibles, but that is pieces, books of the Bible, sections of the Bible, commentary, copies of the Bible, different translations, early authentic translations of the Bible. That says 2014. That's Old and New Testament. And in those we see a remarkable consistency. Now, if we look around a number of books written today, that may not sound like a lot. I mean, a popular book may have hundreds of thousands of copies made of it. But for an ancient document, where sometimes you had 2 or 4 or 10 or 15 copies of it, there are quite a few numbers and manuscripts of it. The other piece that we have is that the date is within a few centuries before and after Jesus' death. So when we look at ancient documents, we want to know how far from the original document was this done, or how far from the time period. So we as Americans, we have a copy of the original Declaration of Independence. We have that. It's under glass, it's storage. That's not something we have for the ancient documents. Frequently they're destroyed through age, wear and tear, other means of being destroyed. And so you want to see how close you can get those copies to the original time period. And in the case of the scripture, right around Jesus' time, a few centuries before, we have some of the copies of the Old Testament. A few centuries afterwards, we have copies of the New Testament, really shortening that timeline. And it makes sure that as close to the original event you can have the copies, the more trustworthy it is. We also see that the testimony of Mark in particular, Mark is the second gospel. It was established, most people say, before Caiaphas' rule as high priest was over in 37 AD, since they didn't use his name. And what this means is when we're looking at the testimony of Mark in particular, they don't call Caiaphas the high priest by his name. During each period, Caiaphas being one of them, there's only one high priest, and so it would have been unnecessary to use his name because he was the only one. If it had been written during later times or later periods of priests, after 37 AD, it would have been a different high priest. Then you would have had to specify who the high priest was. It would have been similar if we were saying, if we lived during the presidency of George Washington and said, hey, the president, passed this bill or gave this speech. We wouldn't have to ask which president because we were living during the president, and at that time the only president. And in a similar way, a lot of people say Mark was established, the testimony, whether that's the first time it was penned or that's the piece that is memorized before 37 AD, since they didn't actually address Caiaphas by name. Now, but in Matthew, Luke, and John, they all specifically identified Caiaphas as being the high priest, so we know who it was. But the testimony from Mark seems to be exceptionally early, and many people put the date of writing in the early 40s. That's within a decade of when Jesus died. We also see the piece of unflattering testimonies. So when you're looking at evidence, and we're looking at the Gospels, one of the things that people look at and say, man, this seems very authentic, is that the Gospels don't always give a good portrayal of those that surrounded Jesus. It's not a flattering example of it. We're going to read one here in John chapter 20. It says, on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and he stood among them and he said to them, peace be with you. Now, when we're looking at this document being unflattering, if you were writing a book to portray the start of a new movement, it's highly unlikely you would portray the original founders and the original leaders as cowards. But that's exactly how they're portrayed here. That after Jesus has died, and even after he's resurrected, that everyone's hiding in their room because they're afraid of the Jews. They didn't portray themselves as men of courage and bravery, but of cowardice. And we also see that it says that Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, who said was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." This is doubling down on the refusal to believe the key tenet of Christianity, that Jesus rose from the grave. This does not look highly upon the disciples. Over and over again, we see in response to Jesus' crucifixion and his resurrection, we don't see initial belief, we don't see initial courage, we don't see initial bravery, we see fear, and we see a lack of belief. And when people look at these ancient documents, the more unflattering they are, the more credible they make it seem. Because as human beings, we like to tell stories and think of ourselves in ways that are flattering. And so we tend to write or reflect on it in those ways. And so the more unflattering a story is to the authors or the authorial perspective, the more likely people look at this and say, wow, that's probably true. It says 8 days later, the disciples were inside, Thomas was with them, the door was locked, Jesus came and he stood among them. He said, "Peace be with you." He said, "Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Here Jesus is encouraging them to believe that even though he's standing right in front of them, he has been raised from the dead. He said, you can feel the wounds, you can touch them. He says, but you need to believe. We also see that women are the first to see and the first to respond. Now, in this period of time, the testimony of a woman was not considered valid in even a court of law. So a testimony from a woman regarding a situation would have meant very little or almost nothing. Which, if you were trying at that point in time to make a strong and solid case for someone rising from the dead, you would naturally pick the leaders and probably the 12 disciples, the followers of Jesus, the men who could testify in court to what they'd seen. But we see that unlike that, in this account, we see that it's actually women who were the first to see and the first to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. And it tells us who these people were. It says, now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told these things to the apostles. But these seemed to be an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Here we have the women seeing Jesus and believing and following him, and still the disciples, the men, the ones that should be understanding what's going on, the ones that had spent years with Jesus, are missing it. And so this is, once again, a unflattering reflection that the women are first to see and they're first to respond. And so when we look at these unflattering pieces, these usually come from a place of truth, because it certainly doesn't make us think more highly of the disciples, and it certainly doesn't make us think more highly of the followers of Jesus. We also see the timing of the testimony. First of all, these testimonies were circulated in the lifetime of the witnesses. Now, why is this important? Well, if you came out with an event and said, hey, 100 years ago this happened, and you came out with an outrageous story, well, how do you go back? I mean, you can look at journals from people, you can look at news articles, but it's so hard to prove or disprove that because you waited until those who would have been around to see it are deceased. In this case, the disciples are beginning to proclaim, and these are written in the lifetime of the witnesses. 1 Corinthians 15 says that Jesus appeared to more than 500, and Paul, when he's writing that letter, he says, hey, most of them are still alive. You can go talk to them. You can go down and interview person after person after person. And whether 300 or 400 or 450 were still alive, he says you can go talk to those witnesses and they'll tell you what they saw. We also see that the Gospel of Mark, if it was written sometime in the early 40s, it's 10 years after the event happened, it would have been very easy to go around and check with the people that Mark was talking about. Did they exist? Were they real? What did they see? And you can verify this yourself. Also, because the testimony was initially proclaimed in Jerusalem, Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, he was buried in Jerusalem, he rose from the grave in Jerusalem, and the message started to be shared in Jerusalem, it would have been contested and corrected. If Peter and the other disciples were going around and said Jesus was risen from the dead in Jerusalem and the tomb was still sealed, it would have been so easy for the Pharisees to say, let's go walk down to the tomb, check it out, and you're going to find that the tomb is still filled. They were preaching it and speaking of it and testifying to it in the one area that would have been hardest to fake. They were doing that in Jerusalem, and it wasn't contested or corrected. I think it also is important to contrast this with other accounts. When we look at the Gospels, we see what is not uncommon when you hear testimonies. We see a little bit different perspectives. Some people focus on one incident, some people focus on another incident. We see some people focusing on just Mary Magdalene and her journey, some focused on all the other women that were included with her. But it's a simple, straightforward account that you read it and it reads like you would read as someone sat there and wrote down at the end of the day what they saw. And we compare this to other legends or later legends. We see the Gospel of Peter in an example, written about AD 125, so written about 100 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And in this account, there is actually a resurrection account in this, but we see heads that are stretching out of the tombs. So apparently 3 people exited the tomb, and 2 of their heads stretched to the heaven, and then Jesus' head stretched through the heaven. I can't quite picture what that looks like. And then there's also a cross that comes out of the tomb or is there at the tomb, and the cross is talking. It's a talking wooden cross. And we see that this kind of legend doesn't read like history. It reads fictitious. It is incomprehensible as we look at that. And so we look at the quality of the evidence. Now I want us to keep in mind when we're looking at these pieces, we're looking at clues. And we're looking at like a puzzle. And not one of these pieces on itself is enough to probably say, oh, absolutely. But as we see piece after piece come together, what we're trying to do is together gather these data points, gather these bits of information, and put them together and arrange them on the table and say, okay, what order makes the most sense? What's the most logical conclusion? We see that the quality of evidence is extremely high for the resurrection story. There's thousands and thousands of manuscripts and bits of manuscripts that agree just across the board. We see that the testimony compared to some of the other ones is highly unflattering of the early followers of Jesus. And then as we look at those unflattering testimonies, we say, what's the motivation to recount a story in which you look like an idiot? And we see that over and over again, both for the disciples and the early followers of Jesus. We see that the women were pivotal in the resurrection story in all the Gospels. And at the time, that wouldn't have made any sense if you were trying to fake a story to have women be the first and primary witnesses to the resurrection. We also see that the other stories, like the Gospel of Peter, the legends there, we read those and in contrast to what we see in the Gospels, is that really the only crazy thing that happens in the Gospel stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is that Jesus rose from the dead. Everything else reads like normal history, except for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And so what we're trying to look at is as we look at the evidence together, and we say, what is the best explanation for these data points? Are the Gospels an authentic witness to it? And based on the evidence we see internally in the Gospels, based on the number of Gospels we have, and the age of the Gospels, I think we have to say, yeah, these are very reliable witnesses that all say the same thing, that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm excited to continue this series with you. We're going to be looking at some of the other theories to explain this evidence in a little bit, and then a couple other claims that Jesus made that I think you're going to find really exciting. Thanks so much for joining with us as we look at the question, did Jesus rise from the dead?